A young man discovers a monster trapped in his barn and sees it as a unique chance to change his life. But what could go wrong, right? Let's find out. The film begins with scenes of a man, armed with a rifle, desperately entering the dense forest. He is fleeing from a sinister presence, running between the trees, his heart racing and eyes wide with fear. Suddenly, this mysterious figure catches up to him, a vampire with yellow eyes and dagger-like teeth. In a ferocious attack, the vampire sinks its teeth into the man's neck, but is surprised by the rising sun that starts to burn its skin. The sun, appearing as a hero, does not spare the man, whose skin also begins to burn, a chilling side effect of the vampire bite. As the vampire disintegrates into ashes, the man, now marked by fate, resumes his desperate run, dodging the sun's rays. In an almost instinctive move, he covers himself with a piece of burlap found by chance and takes refuge in the barn of a nearby property, where his transformation into a creature of the night is completed. Meanwhile, in an almost peaceful contrast, the scene shifts to the house adjacent to the barn, where Stan, a young teenager, is getting ready for another day. He descends to the kitchen where he witnesses a tender moment between his parents. The mood is light. His father proposes a trip to the family cabin for the weekend and promises to teach Stan to drive, an idea the boy receives with enthusiasm. However, the serenity is cut short by a terrible nightmare. His mother appears visibly debilitated and exhausted, and his father ends his own life with a gunshot. Stan awakens from this night terror to the sound of his grandfather Ellis, impatiently knocking on the door, criticizing the boy's irresponsibility. Ellis, in his severe tone, scolds Stan for his conduct and reminds him of the obligations he bears, thanks to his grandfather's efforts in getting him out of juvenile detention. Stan avoids arguing, apologizes in a low voice, and heads to school by bike. However, his route is soon interrupted by ill-intentioned classmates who almost cause an accident. He ends up colliding with the sheriff's car, but luckily, the damage is minor. The deputy sheriff, after an inspection, warns him about the future implications of such incidents, especially with adulthood approaching. Sheriff Dorney, on the other hand, is more understanding, suggesting that Stan just needs a break after the adversities faced in juvenile detention. At school, Stan sees the troublemakers who almost ran him off the road, now harassing his friend Dahmer. Without hesitation, Stan steps in to protect him and almost has a direct confrontation with their leader, Marble. However, the situation is interrupted by a teacher who reprimands them and sends them to class. Deciding to ignore the recommendation, Stan and Dahmer opt to spend the day out of school. During a casual stroll around town, they discuss the bully's abuses and Roxy, a girl Stan secretly has feelings for. Dahmer, curious, asks when Stan plans to ask her out. He denies any romantic interest, insisting on pure friendship, despite Dahmer reminding him that the rivalry with Marble intensified precisely when Roxy started hanging out with them. Despite Dahmer's comments about Roxy, Stan defends her fervently and asks him to change the subject. Later, when returning home, Stan isolates himself in the attic. There, he immerses himself in music and contemplates old photographs with his parents, diving into childhood memories. In a moment of introspection, he observes a prominent scar on his hand. In a dark impulse, he grabs a knife, pondering hurting himself again. However, sudden regret takes over, and in a gesture of anger, he stabs the knife into the attic floor. Interruptions are not long in coming, as his grandfather starts yelling from downstairs, demanding that he tend to the garden. Stan obeys and, accompanied by his dog, heads to the barn. As they approach, the dog starts barking incessantly, prompting Stan to check inside the barn. Inside, he discovers several human teeth scattered on the ground. While analyzing the macabre scene, a sinister figure reveals itself in the shadows, a man transformed into a vampire. Stan hears a growl and, terrified, runs out of the barn, mistaking him for a dangerous drug addict, and threatens to unleash his dog if the intruder does not leave. No one moves inside the barn, leading Stan to release the dog, which charges in barking. The subsequent silence is disturbing. Calling out for the animal with no response, the tension rises until the barn door abruptly opens and the dog's decapitated head is thrown out. Stunned and horrified, Stan runs back to the house and heads straight to the kitchen in search of a knife. At that moment, Ellis appears. Still breathless, Stan reports that a maniac killed the dog. Initially skeptical, Ellis soon realizes the gravity of the situation upon not finding the dog and decides to inspect the barn personally. There, he confirms the terrible scene and tries to give the psychopath one last chance to surrender. With the intruder's refusal, Ellis enters the barn, only to find the animal's body and prepare to reprimand Stan, but he is surprisingly attacked by the vampire. Stan, hearing the sounds of struggle, runs to Ellis's aid. Emerging briefly at the barn entrance, Ellis, gravely wounded, is dragged back into the shadows by the vampire, disappearing into the darkness. With his heart pounding, Stan runs to lock the barn door, using thick chains to ensure that nothing can get out. Back at the house, he tries to calm his nerves with a cold beer. While considering calling the police, Stan finds a document about someone's parole and decides to keep the situation away from the sheriff's eyes to avoid complications. As night falls, he reinforces the windows and doors with nails and wood, seeking a sense of security before surrendering to sleep. However, a disturbance in the middle of the night wakes him abruptly. Sounds of someone tampering with his bedroom door make him think his grandfather is nearby. But upon checking, Stan finds the room empty. Restless, he searches every room in the house, finding no one, though mysterious noises continue to echo. Intrigued and fearful, he walks towards the barn, where he notices a faint light emanating. However, to his relief, he soon realizes it was just another terrifying dream. The next day, Roxy seeks out Stan to clarify recent tensions. She understands Stan's reluctance to accept her association with Marble and his group, but explains she will continue to ally with whoever benefits her plans until she can leave town after graduation. Despite Stan expressing skepticism about Roxy's future behavior change, the conversation takes a personal turn as they discuss their families. Roxy comments on how it's common for people to dislike their parents but hesitates, remembering Stan is grieving. He, however, admits he also feels resentment for their absence in his life. As Stan starts to open up about what happened to his grandfather, Dahmer interrupts them, causing Roxy to leave hastily. Stan reproaches Dahmer for interrupting such a crucial moment. Soon after, Dahmer finds himself again targeted by Marble's bullies. Dahmer is brutally attacked. Meanwhile, he notices something unsettling from his house window, a figure trying to open the barn door. Armed with a bat, he cautiously approaches the barn, questioning if anyone is there. With no response, he gets closer to the door. Suddenly, Stan is jolted from his investigation by another vivid nightmare, where Dahmer accuses him of neglecting their friendship in favor of Roxy, leading to the attack he suffered. Upon waking, Dahmer, still incredulous and demanding proof of the horrors Stan recounted, insists on seeing the inside of the barn. Preparing for the worst, Stan rushes to find materials to repair the door before nightfall. Meanwhile, Dahmer, curious, gets too close to the barn, giving the vampire a chance to escape. In a swift act, Stan manages to close the opening with a metal plate. Far from feeling fear, Dahmer is overcome with excitement. He proposes an audacious idea to Stan: use the vampire as a tool to intimidate or even eliminate their adversaries. Suggesting a plan where they would invite their enemies to his house and lock them in the barn, Dahmer sees an opportunity to turn the tables against those who tormented them for so long. Stan, however, is terrified by Dahmer's suggestion. He tries to make Dahmer understand that the vampire is a real and unpredictable threat, not just to Marble and his gang, but to anyone. Stan insists that Dahmer keep the secret about the monster, fearing that knowledge of it could bring severe legal consequences. Reluctantly, Dahmer agrees to remain silent, although his expression suggests he might be plotting something on his own. That night, Stan watches a classic vampire movie that describes in detail methods to combat these creatures: exposure to sunlight, a wooden stake through the heart, and decapitation. During the movie, he falls asleep and dreams that Roxy turns into a vampire and bites him, a vivid nightmare that jolts him awake in panic. After checking that he is alone, he, armed with a drill, heads to the barn and creates several holes through which sunlight penetrates, wounding the imprisoned vampire. Back in the house, Sheriff Dorney appears unexpectedly. She asks about Ellis, Stan's grandfather, and he quickly responds that Ellis was busy with chores and wouldn't be back soon. Dorney also mentions the disappearance of Joe Bain, a local resident, and questions if Ellis had any issues with him, but Stan denies any knowledge. She decides to enter and investigate further, showing Stan a photo of a man who had turned into a vampire. Stan, maintaining his facade, insists he does not recognize him. The sheriff then offers to take him to school, despite Stan's discomfort. At school, after getting out of the sheriff's car, Stan meets Roxy, who is concerned about the scratches on his face. She wants to know what he was trying to tell her earlier, but the conversation is interrupted by Marble, who makes provocative and unpleasant comments. Unable to contain his anger, Stan lunges at Marble. As the tension escalates, the teacher intervenes, informing Stan about the possibility of a temporary suspension and the imminent visit of Sheriff Dorney to his house. Worried about the implications of Dorney finding the barn, Stan rushes home, but Dorney is already there, knocking on the door without receiving an answer. Hearing strange noises coming from the barn, the sheriff decides to investigate, convinced it might be Ellis asking for help. When Dorney shoots the lock to access the barn, Stan arrives in desperation, trying to convince her that it's not his grandfather, but Joe Bain who is trapped inside. However, the sheriff, suspicious of his story and believing Stan is hiding something, declares him under arrest. Ignoring his protests, she opens the barn door, and in a moment of terror, a vampire attacks, biting her neck, tearing off her arm, and dragging her body inside the barn. Simultaneously, the tension rises with the arrival of Marble, seeking revenge for his public humiliation. When Marble is about to attack Stan with brass knuckles, the sound of gunshots echoes. Dahmer, determined to end the years of torment, shoots near Marble, coercing him to enter the barn under the threat of being shot. Terrified and with no options, Marble enters, and soon after, horrendous screams are heard from inside. In the heat of the moment, Dahmer, consumed by rage, hits Stan with the weapon to silence him after he accuses Dahmer of killing Marble. After a period of unconsciousness, Stan wakes up next to Roxy, who is clearly worried. Realizing the barn door is open and there is no sign of Dahmer, Stan grabs a baseball bat and cautiously enters the barn. Inside the darkness, he encounters Marble, and instead of finding Joe Bain, sees Dahmer transformed into a vampire. Dahmer reveals that Bain is no longer there, but will certainly return. As he approaches, Dahmer claims to be stronger now, challenging their former friendship. Desperate, Stan appeals to the memory of their friendship, but Dahmer, now consumed by his new vampiric nature, attacks. In the struggle, Stan manages to wound Dahmer with the bat and expose his arm to the sunlight, burning his skin and revealing his vulnerability. Dahmer collapses in pain under the effect of the sunlight, falling unconscious. Deeply shocked, Stan leaves the barn and is immediately confronted by Roxy, who demands explanations. Before Stan can formulate a response, he watches the daylight finally consume Dahmer, leaving only a charred body. Covering his friend's remains with a white sheet, he finally shares the horrid truth with Roxy, who insists on helping him. Together, they take the body back to the barn and prepare the place, reinforcing the windows and preparing weapons, ready to face the imminent threat of Bain. Meanwhile, night falls and Bain awakens in an unknown location in the forest. At Stan's house, the situation complicates when Pitt and Ozzy, Marble's friends, arrive demanding answers about Marble's whereabouts. Stan and Roxy try to assure them that he is not there and ask them to leave. However, when Bain approaches, Ozzy realizes the danger and decides to flee, while Pitt, overcome by panic, begs for shelter inside the house. Roxy, trying to control the situation, reveals Marble's death and warns Pitt about the fate he could share if he doesn't calm down. Suddenly, the vampire cuts the power, plunging the house into darkness. Stan and Roxy, confident they have secured the house, question the attic, a place Roxy was unaware of. Noises upstairs lead them to investigate with Pitt. Stan, armed with knowledge on how to combat vampires, guides the group in a cautious search through the rooms. The terror intensifies when Pitt, while closing an open window, is startled by Ozzy, now a vampire. In another room, as Stan grabs a shotgun, Roxy is distracted by old photographs, at which point Bain attacks her, dragging her to the attic. Subsequently, Stan confronts Marble's vampirized friends, hiding and eventually eliminating two of them with a shotgun blast. Rushing to the attic, he arrives in time to prevent Bain from biting Roxy. Although Stan shoots and attacks Bain with an axe, the vampire proves resilient, surviving multiple attacks and counterattacking violently. In a desperate moment, Roxy, though injured, manages to decapitate Bain with a precise axe blow, putting an end to the terror. Exhausted and traumatized, Stan and Roxy gather the vampires' bodies and incinerate them in the barn, watching the flames consume the last remnants of the threat. At dawn, they find a moment of respite in Marble's car. Stan, uncertain, asks Roxy about the trunk, but she believes he had taken care of it. At that moment, the trunk lid slowly opens, a sinister sign that the fight against the forces of darkness might not be over, leaving an air of uncertainty and fear about what might still be lurking in the shadows.